Hello and welcome to A Critical Dragon, where I talk about narrative in film, television, and in books. And today I am joined by Philip Sauron Chase. Hello, Philip.
Jeez. Well, I am charming and all that, I suppose, right?
And a deceiver.
Uh-oh.
Well, we're here to discuss Rings of Power season 2, episode 4, which is called Eldest. And this, I think, and as far as season 2 is going, this I think showcases what I feel are the weakest aspects of some of the decisions that the showrunners and writers made about the entire project. It was stuff that had come up in season 1, and they were elements that I was struggling to enjoy as much. And so, very briefly to outline this, my major problems with a bunch of this. Firstly, there is no direct source material that they are adapting. That they made the decision that they are taking stuff from the appendices to fill things in. And the appendices of The Lord of the Rings, stuff from The Hobbit, they're using that as a way to create a new show, which in general, I think is actually an interesting approach because you're not then bound to exactly how things went.
Right.
But the issue with that is some of the stuff got filled in the Silmarillion, but the Silmarillion is a fragmented work.
Right.
Tolkien never, it is never a polished, finished whole. It is a sequence of some discontiguous narrative sequences that they are not all joined together. They are loosely joined together. And then because we have then the histories and the untold tales, all of these were fragments that have been kind of patched together, and there is no cohesive outline to follow. And the showrunners don't even have the license to use a lot of that material. And yet they still chose to make this adaptation in basically the Second Age. In and of itself, it's not a major issue, except the Second Age is huge. And this is
Mm.
where I think the big problem comes in.
Right.
In order to do that, they to create something that was semi-cohesive, to use a lot of the same actors, they conflated the timeline. And that meant sticking a bunch of things together that don't naturally go together because there were hundreds of years between them in the history.
Right.
And in general, like messing around with timelines, again, is not a huge deal. It's just it becomes difficult. And it then means that you're picking and choosing things to plop in that don't naturally fit there.
Right.
The other second issue, or the other major issue, was there's a lot of stuff. And instead of focusing primarily on, say, the elvish story with Sauron and focusing on that as the main story and having things drift in and out of it, but focusing on this one main story,
Right.
they were trying to do all of it. And
Yeah.
this episode 4, I think, shows what happens when you are juggling so many different balls in the air
Right.
that you are trying to touch on each of them. But because of that, none of them feel really connected. And it's harder to get a sense of a continuous and contiguous storyline developed when you're picking and choosing from all of these different plot threads.
Right.
And that, I think, is fundamentally for me the major issue that Rings of Power has as a show, is that they are trying to do so much. And because they are so thinly spread across this very broad palette of storylines, it sometimes feels that each one we only just start get going with when suddenly we're on to the next one. And it feels like little tiny episodes of things, which, when we think of the structure of the Silmarillion, is actually quite accurate to a lot of what happens in the Silmarillion. Here is the
Hmm.
episode with this thing. And 100 years later, here is the episode with this thing. But for me, trying to draw on elements of the Lord of the Rings to put them in this show,
Yeah.
to create those resonances and echoes. And we saw that with the spiders in the previous episode. They were more comfortable in The Lord of the Rings, because Tolkien had polished that arc until the things all lined up, which is why it is the published work. Fragments are much harder to join together. They have these jagged edges. And I think
Yeah.
that comes across particularly in this episode. I
This,
don't
this
know if you.
episode, yeah, it felt like to me a bunch of disconnected Middle Earth cameos, and it just, it sounds a little harsh, but it did feel very disconnected to me. I do think that as much as I love a cameo from a beloved character or something like that, I just think they should have tried to jam less into this and stuck a little more to some of the narrative threads to give them justice, rather than me feeling like that was jarring. To the degree that they even have certain lines that didn't work as well, where they play the "go back to the shadow" line. Galadriel steals that line from Gandalf, and it doesn't work as well in that scene where Galadriel says "go back to the shadow" as it worked when Gandalf said it to the Balrog. I mean, it just felt like a failed attempt to, in that case, and in a few other cases, to pay homage, let's say. That was the intent, I think, was to pay homage, to make connections to the world of Middle Earth through, in terms of Tolkien's books, and also even the Peter Jackson films. Again, I think they're you get these little nuanced, sometimes nods. In terms of the atmosphere and the music and everything else, and visually, yeah, the show is amazing, and the soundtrack continues to be fantastic. But this just felt so jumbled to me, and so disconnected and so abrupt in many places, that I did not enjoy this episode. This is the episode that worked the least for me in season 2 so far. And it's slightly disappointing because I really did enjoy episodes 1 and 2. And I think some of what I am objecting to really started in episode 3, and it just got going like a locomotive in episode 4. So that's my assessment overall. I'm still going to watch the rest of the season, hoping that we can get back to some cleaner storytelling. But
But
let's see.
but even with these, like, there are elements here that I still genuinely enjoyed. Like,
Sure.
I'm watching the show, I'm enjoying the show. It, for the most part, looks absolutely gorgeous. The soundtrack is amazing.
Hmm.
A lot of the acting has been great, despite what
Hmm.
some people have said. Uh,
Yep.
the sound design, like the sound effects, like
Yep.
some of those have been brilliant.
Agreed.
Um, it's again jumping between a lot of these different storylines that don't seem to naturally bind themselves together.
Right.
And it's not necessarily bad writing. It's just not fulfilling what it could have been. And I think with a narrower focus, it could have been far more streamlined and cohesive. And
Right.
that lack of cohesion lends to this, not mess. I think mess is far too strong a word for it.
Uh-huh.
But it lends to the fact that
I might have used that word in private, but okay.
no,
Yeah.
no, but and I can understand people feeling that. But for instance, so let's talk about the stranger and the dark wizard.
Okay. Let's talk about that thread. Yeah.
Um, the fact that we are getting the Blue Wizard storyline. This is the Blue Wizard storyline. I am incredibly happy about that.
Yes, you're getting your Blue Wizard storyline
So
finally.
regardless of who these wizards are named as or what turns out, who the people, I am getting the actual storyline that I wanted, and I am really, really happy about that.
He's been given a name. Was it the Dark Wizard or something?
Yeah,
Uh,
the Dark Wizard. You know, like it's a script. It's a
could it be
description,
the Dark Blue Wizard?
but it
Maybe.
but it's like the Dark
The-
Wizard, the Stranger. It's like stop giving them descriptors. Just
right.
give them a name, even if it's not, what was it, Palando and Alatar. Like, if you're not going to use their names because you don't have the rights to the names, fine. Give them a placeholder name. Because
The
right
Navy
now,
Blue Wizard.
giving giving them labels for what they are is frustrating. It's creating a sense of a mystery box, and I absolutely hate, in the vast majority of instances, mystery box storytelling. Building
Yeah.
it up as if this is it is almost always underwhelming when the reveal happens. This is one of
Yeah.
the why I hate mystery box. In the first season, oh, who is Sauron? What would have been much more enjoyable for me would have been the audience knowing definitively who Sauron was and
Right.
watching the other characters figure it out, seeing them make mistakes, that gets me engaged. But
Hmm.
the constant guessing game about these things is exhausting and it is just not enjoyable. So I dislike that style of storytelling.
Yeah.
Um, oh, he wants to get a staff. Right, fine, whatever. Stop making it a major element of what he is trying to do. Why is he there? Is it to get a staff? Is it to find I give him a definitive thing to do, please.
Apparently he's there so Tom Bombadil can have a cameo.
Well, I think seeing Bombadil on screen, I think gets across why one of the major reasons why Jackson removed Bombadil from
In the
the film.
first place. Yeah, yeah.
Because I'm like, for a lot of readers of the Lord of the Rings, when you get to the Bombadil sections, it seems something far more appropriate for The Hobbit than it
Yeah.
does the Lord of the Rings. It He doesn't seem to fit with the overall tone and tenor. And the thing is, fascinating character, really,
Yeah.
really interesting. And I thought, given that he is viewed as very tonally dissonant by a lot of readers, that that was going to come across here as well. And I think they tried to tone down that jolliness to make him less tonally dissonant,
Yeah.
which ultimately had the effect of, well, then he's less Tom Bombadil. So
Yeah.
it's that uneasy trying to please the representation that is in Tolkien and adhere to that, or as people online, being faithful, being
Right.
faithful to that, but trying to do it in a way that fits with what they are doing. And
Yeah.
again, I think it's a very uneasy tightrope that they're trying to walk, and not every step is going to land.
Bombadil is always going to be a hard character to adapt. That's for sure, I think. And the fact that he doesn't quite fit in even Tolkien's mythos, he's not he remains a mystery of a sort, and he's outside of everything else. I thought while we were watching, my wife actually made a really astute comment. She said, "Oh, this guy," because she hasn't read Lord of the Rings, but she's read some Malazan, and she said, "So this Bombadil character, he's like Krupp, right? He's kind of the Krupp of Middle Earth. Krupp being a character in Malazan Book of the Fallen." I thought actually that's kind of a good observation, isn't it? But yeah, that does make him hard to adapt, and I'm not sure it ever really worked for me to have Bombadil apparently be a kind of mentor figure for whom the stranger, whom I'm still assuming is Gandalf. Um,
Gandalf the
and
Blue.
what's that?
Gandalf the Blue.
Gandalf in your dreams. The yeah, I mean he's and having the sort of old man Willow scene with Gandalf there, it was just kind of like, oh no, please don't do this. It did not work well for me. Having Bombadil be there in Rune, and yeah, okay, they tried to cover it up with him being sort of this mysterious, oh, I'm just where I need to be, and I just skip around and here and there. Ironically, of course, Galadriel and Elrond are traipsing around where much closer to where Tom Bombadil actually, in Lord of the Rings at least, lives. But anyway, it was
But
just it didn't work well for me.
but they did describe that Bombadil's land, like where he lived, had shrunk over time.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, yeah.
it
There's an
currently,
ecological theme there, I guess they're getting in there, which is Tolkienian,
yeah. And again, the whole thing with the tree, I'm like, okay, you did the Palantir last episode,
yeah,
and now we're getting eaten by the tree this episode. We also had the spiders last episode. This is Lord of the Rings greatest hits.
exactly. That's my problem with this
Lord of the
episode.
Rings greatest hits, the cover band version. And again, I like that they're drawing from material, but at the same
Right.
time, I go, I've already seen this. Why are you included? Why would
Not only have I already seen this, but it was done better the first time. So why would you do that? Yeah.
and also like it makes it look like Bombadil likes setting up shop next to these really evil trees that like eating people. You're like,
Yeah.
and but even calling it like, what was it, old man iron tree or something instead of old man.
Yes, yes, yeah. Come
it's not
on.
even an original name, and it just
Yeah.
I was so disappointed in that because
Yeah.
that is literally just the same episode from the Lord of the Rings that you stuck in here, and
Yeah.
it felt
And I'm not sure I like Gandalf being made into a Frodo figure in this case. It does not really. I mean, I get that he's at this point naive in his journey. He doesn't know who he is. He's looking for his staff. Okay, but I just don't feel that moment worked particularly well for that character.
but
Yes, for a Frodo, yeah, perfect, but not for Gandalf.
but I will admit one of the things I did enjoy about this whole sequence was Goldberry singing,
Uh-huh.
and the stranger like, is there someone else here? And no, because Goldberry's a river spirit.
Yeah.
Bombadil is singing with the river spirit. This is before Bombadil and Goldberry get together.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
And so she's still a river spirit and isn't the sort of the manifest in the body thing. I actually like that as an interpretation of it.
That's
I thought
interesting. Yeah.
that was nice and it was fun.
Yeah.
Um and I have no issues with any of that. Bombadil having ostentatious magic, on the other hand, was a choice
Right.
where he frightens the little lamb with that big blast of fire, where he
Right.
shows like lighting all of the candles all in one go. The
Right.
all of those things, again, he is elemental, and I get that. But and again, part of it goes to a personal interpretation about Bombadil. That's not who Bombadil was to me. And so it's hard to see that as recreating the character or taking the character from the Lord of the Rings and putting him here because it seems to change the very nature of who Bombadil is.
Mm-hmm.
But
Mm-hmm.
but again, I agree with you. The Bombadil was always going to be incredibly difficult
Right.
to put in any adaptation
Right.
because he is such a curious, strange, unknowable character.
A misfit, really, in many ways. Yeah.
Um, I did think it was interesting that we get confirmation that the Dark Wizard is an Istari, that
Yeah.
he had come through there before, had picked up some of these tricks from Bombadil, which again is a direction I don't. They're Istari. They don't need to
We don't
learn
need
magic
Tom
from Bombadil.
Bombadil. He's different. He's not. Yeah. Yeah.
Um, but then has been corrupted, and this then ties into the second Blue Wizard. His duty is to go and fix this problem. I
Mm-hmm.
like that, and again, it's the we get that moment where he decides to take the branch, and Bombadil is like, "Did you even ask?"
Yes. I like that line. Yeah.
And one of the reasons I like that is again, damaging something for the greater good. Because I need a staff, I am going to do this thing, even though I should have respected. Tying into that acknowledgement of the ends justify the means, which is
Mm-hmm.
clearly what a lot of the more evil or the darker characters are doing. And the
Right.
good characters learning that that level of compromise can come back to bite you and it's not necessarily the best way. That continuity, that I enjoyed. Like
Mm-hmm.
I don't have a criticism of that, but
Right.
I think I yeah, the where even when Bombadil turns around and you have that moment where he's framed and looking at the screen, and it was almost like one of those 1980s TV shows where it's starring, and it was the freeze frame for like a half second too long, where you go, yeah, yeah, we get it, we're all meant to know who this is.
Yeah.
It was about as subtle as a breeze block through your window, going, look, it's Tom Bombadil. Um,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
that I was disappointed. But again, having that conversation and having Bombadil sing and um, getting the confirmation about the Blue Wizard storyline, those things I was happy about.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and confirmation, like Bombadil is eldest. And we get introduced to some very ancient creatures in this because, of course, we get the Ents later on, and we actually get a much greater level of knowledge of them.
Mm-hmm.
And an Ent wife, which is awesome.
Yes,
But
and yeah, yeah, good for
um,
that. Although not quite the way I mean, we never actually meet an Entwife because they're gone in Lord of the Rings. They're famously missing. But
And so with this, with Bombadil being eldest, the Ent wives and the Ents being these exceptionally long-lived creatures, Adar being the eldest orc, there are a lot of plays on words in this one that I actually liked.
mhm.
And, but let's talk about one of the other episodes, unless there's more about Bombadil you want to talk about.
Well, I mean, close, sort of parallel with it is the what's happening with Nori and Poppy. They're over there as well, so I guess we might as well talk about that, which is again not my favorite thread. Um, yeah, so they meet some stores there in Rune, and there's an attempt to connect them through this story that they have, this story of their wandering that we has been alluded to from season one. So it seems like this is something that's been very much planned out, I guess. But yeah, there's of course you do have the three types of hobbits that I guess evolved in Middle Earth. You have the Harfoots, Nori and Poppy and her people, and you have the Stores and the Falahides. I don't think they're going to appear in Rings of Power. Who knows? Maybe they will.
No, but I'm sure they're saving that for season 3.
Maybe.
Right. No, anyone who watched us discuss season 1 knows that the
Not your
Harfoot
favorite,
storyline is not my favorite.
right?
It just isn't. I don't particularly enjoy it. What they did with this, so we had with the Harfoots that they were traveling, tying it into that and say that the initial impetus had been to go and find a home. But
Right.
because the journey was taking so long, the journey became the cultural sort of touchstone for them, that the journey became everything. They were no longer looking for a home anymore. They
Right.
were these nomads. I actually quite liked that. I
An
thought that
interesting
was very
touch.
clever.
Yeah.
Um, and tying it into the fact that they had come from living underground, but were looking for a nicer place to live,
Yeah.
and the adventurous spirit that we saw with the Harfoots. We see these different elements that are going to tie together to form the complex personalities of when ultimately they become the hobbits and the people in the Shire. That was all fine, but like I don't need more hobbits. I don't really care about the Hobbit storyline. I've never really cared about the Hobbit storyline.
Yeah.
Um, but it was nice seeing a different form, a proto form of the Shire.
Uh-huh. In a
And
desert setting, which is okay. Yeah.
um and it was like when Poppy and oh, what's the other one?
Nori.
Nori,
Yeah.
got sucked up by the twister. And it's like, we're not in Kansas anymore. You're like,
That was honestly, I just had to sort of grimace when they
oh,
just kind of, oh my goodness, wow, what a breeze,
it's
oh
what a
gosh.
shock. They're not in Kansas anymore. And they're
Yeah.
um so there were aspects of that again,
Yeah.
the set was actually fascinating. All of the different pipe work that they had, the little tubes so they could irrigate and bringing the water in. Like
Right.
there was fun stuff there. You can see that element of when they settle the Shire and they have access to all this, why it becomes so agrarian.
Right.
The focus on agriculture and food and the little society. And
Yeah.
even their attitude of being much more defensive and aggressive because of the threat, which over time, when they are in the Shire, relaxes. And although they're kind of a little touch xenophobic
Right.
in the Shire, it's a much friendlier place.
Right.
You can see how
The
that
softer
has tied
place. Yeah.
that is tied into where they are and how their environment affects them.
Yeah.
Those aspects I don't mind. And the fact that, hobbits were made up of these sort of 3 different types of halflings, it's nice to get recognition of that. I just
Hmm.
wish it wasn't such a big part of this story. I don't think it needed to be a big part of this story.
Uh-huh.
But again, that is a personal preference. And it's because the storylines I am most invested in, the ones that I am most interested in, the elves versus Sauron.
Yeah, well,
That's
this
the
is
big
this is
storyline.
this has been the issue, I think, from season one about this particular thread, that it feels disconnected from the rest of the show. And it still feels disconnected from the rest of the show. So I think that is an issue I think a lot of people have with
Yeah.
this. I assume it's going to get connected eventually, you know. But
And then,
certainly through the stranger, that is a character who has to eventually be introduced into the rest of the show, as I'm assuming Gandalf. Um, but you know, he's obviously got to enter this picture at some point. Otherwise, then I think everyone's complaints are justified that this was a completely disconnected part of the whole thing. So
yeah. So yeah, there's not a huge amount about the Hobbit storyline, the Harfoot storyline that I particularly want to talk about. Like
okay.
they're fun, they're comic relief, but
There's the leader of the stores who I'm sorry, I forget her name, but initially she's kind of hostile to Nori and Poppy, doesn't believe them. But then there's this little element of their story where she wants to, oh, your leader's name was what? Oh, okay. Somebody with that same last name left us here. Is this your story? And then Nori has that moment where she's like, yeah, that's us. And we're still lost. We're still wandering. We never found that home. And then she defends them when the masked dudes show up, and she actually hides them from them. So there was a little bit of a connection made there. It was okay. Yeah.
yeah, and you know, I didn't have a problem with that. It's just that storyline in particular it's just not my favorite. And even the stuff with the stranger and the blue wizard storyline, that I'm interested in. But
Uh-huh.
the all of the Hobbit stuff, I'm like, eh,
Yeah.
eh.
Right. Well, moving
But you know,
on.
that's a personal preference. I know a lot of people love the Hobbits. They love those uh, particular aspects, and that's fine. That's we all like certain things. We all have preferences for certain things. I don't think it was particularly badly done. I think it actually fitted quite nicely with what they are doing in terms of, oh, you know, they bumped into this person and that led them here, and that's your
There are
standard.
moments in this season with this storyline that have made me wince,
Yeah,
to be honest with you. But I like the Nori and Poppy relationship with the stranger. That is one part of the show on as a whole that I've definitely enjoyed more I think than you have.
yeah,
Um,
but and that's what I keep saying. Like we all like or dislike different
yeah,
things. That's fine.
yeah,
I just because this storyline seems so disconnected, and because even if we think of the Blue Wizard storyline, oh yeah, they did something in the East that weakened Sauron. You're like, yeah, but it's still not combining it with what's happening
well, the strongest
in the West.
indication that it's going to get tied in is when the stranger says to Tom Bombadil, oh, I am the one. I'm going to have to be the warrior. I'm going to have to be one who fights these two forces and prevents them from being combined, because combined, Sauron and the Dark Wizard are going to be really bad for the world. So I have a role to play here. And Tom Bombadil is yeah, that's right, because I'm not going to do it. So good luck. So
Um,
that's as close a connection as I've seen.
yeah, and well, the other thing is like Bombadil's line, "All things belong to themselves."
Uh-huh.
The very antithesis of what Sauron is doing.
Right.
And I thought that, you know, again, that's a moment where people complain about the writing, but that line is actually incredibly important. The recognition
Yep.
of autonomy of all of these things, which Sauron is in direct opposition to. He wants to enslave, he wants to control.
Right.
So I thought that was like there are bits and pieces of it that, you know, I still like, and the visuals, the set, like the acting as they run around, like all that's fine. It's just in terms of the storytelling, in terms of what I'm particularly interested in, it
Yeah.
seems like a deviation. It seems like a
It kind of
diversion. It's
sticks
taking
out
us,
like an extra finger or something. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Um, well, what about then? We can finish on Elrond and Galadriel because I think that was actually the
Okay.
strongest part of the
That's
episode.
the biggest part of this episode. Yeah.
But what about Arendir, Isildur, and was it? Oh, I've forgotten her name. Esther, not Esther.
Estrid.
Estrid.
Yeah.
What did you think of that little?
Uh okay, so the whether or not to trust Estrid and her being a spy, or and again, I said before in our previous discussion, I like her introduction to the show. I like the idea that they portray through her that most people are caught in the middle during war and conflict, that most people just want to survive and they have to make difficult decisions, and there's no good decision. There's just what's the lesser evil here. In the case of Estrid and her people, there was a moment when the lesser evil, okay, your choice is die or have this brand put on you and swear allegiance to Adar. And how many people are going to choose the former? Not too many. Most people are going to choose the latter. In that, you're just trying to survive that moment. That's it. That's all that's all they're given. So I like her storyline, that the idea that also she is in the dark as to whether or not her fiance is even alive, and what's the more difficult thing about that? Is it to think that he's dead, or is it to think maybe he's alive and keep looking for him? That's a nice dilemma that she's put in. Obviously, there's some attraction to Isildur that's happening, and maybe the idea that her fiance is dead becomes more more I guess prominent in her mind as she and Isildur get to know each other. But the idea of whether or not to trust her, and you see it literalized with the shackles that Arondir puts on her. He doesn't trust her really, and Isildur is trying to get to know her, feels betrayed by her, feels like he's being used by her. But then, of course, the key moment is when they're in the swamp and Isildur is sucked under, and Arondir as well. And you see her go away, and you initially think, oh, well, I guess she wasn't really very nice. And then she comes back with the big stick and tries to get them out. And okay, so they're trying to do something in that moment there. They're trying to show us, okay, she's not a villain. She's not untrustworthy. She's given, she's risked her life to come back for these two. That scene,
Oh yeah, subtle filmmaking 101. Because when she ran away, we never once suspected that she would come back with a stick to get them out of the equivalent of quicksand. Oh, because we have never once seen this before in our entire lives.
And the other thing about that scene was, okay, did you actually just take line for line some moments from the monster in the lake outside of Moria? I mean, there was just there are things that lurking beneath this world that are, it's like, wait, Arondir, did you just steal a line from the Peter Jackson film too? Because Galadriel does that later on,
But in all honesty, the fact that that giant worm creature was there, first of all, it reminds me very much of something that you had in the Way of Idan.
Oh yes, a Grudug. Yeah.
So if you haven't read Philip's book, you should read Philip's book.
Yeah.
But that aspect of that thing actually being there, that was something I liked, because it wasn't just, oh, I've walked into quicksand, or well, mud in this case, and sunk down. So there were two major elements of that sequence that I really liked. The first is the big monstery thing. The second was Arondir walks on top of the mud.
Yeah.
He walks out on the mud, exactly like Legolas did with the snowbank.
Yeah.
I really like that attention to detail, where Isildur sank down into it, Arondir walks out on top of it. And that thing, that I actually liked. The idea that there are these creatures gnawing in the shadows, in the darkness, at the roots of Middle Earth. And because of the explosion of Mount Doom, because of Sauron's growing influence, because of the extension of the shadow, these things being released and making their way up to the surface, that I actually don't have any problem with, because
like the Barrow Wights too, in the other thread we'll talk about.
The Watcher in the water, that had to have come from somewhere. And you think, oh, well, it was the only thing that escaped. You're like, no, it makes sense that there were these other things. So that one, I have no problem with that. It was just...
You're also good with the echoing of the actual line that Arondir speaks. It sounds like, oh, wait, that line is almost lifted from, the scene with the Watcher. Right?
And that's why I don't object to that line being used. Admittedly, I think it was very deliberately placed there to have that echo and resonance with the Lord of the Rings. We have discussed why I sometimes don't like them taking the Lord of the Rings greatest hits and just plunking them in. But that one I didn't mind as much, because it actually fitted with what was going on. And people expressing the same. I actually don't have the same objection to Galadriel's go back to the shadow that you have.
Uh-huh. I didn't think it worked well in that scene. It was just too on the nose. Again, it was too, can we just please? That's just a little
But
too like, but we'll talk about
we'll,
it later.
yeah, we'll talk about that one later. But the whole running away and the camera lingering there and then running back with the stick. And I'm just like, oh, that I just went, seriously? And again, it was this whole, we're going to give you this moment of mystery. And I'm like, stop, please, for the love of all that is holy. Stop adding in this fake mystery stuff. You don't need it to maintain interest. Having her stand there and go, what do I do? And then reach and grab a stick and stick the stick in would have
Right.
worked just as well. In fact, better, because we would have been tracked on her moment. We could have seen her indecision, her shock, her work through it, and then do it instead of this moment of false drama. Oh, I wonder if she's going to come back. No, I don't. I know that she's going to come back. Otherwise, the camera would have moved. I know that. Oh, look, what a surprise! I am shocked. Um, but the fact that we have that thing there, the fact that we had Arendir walk across the mud, those things I was actually really happy about in those scenes.
Okay, yeah. But in
Um,
terms of the dynamic between Estrid and Isildur and Arendir, the three of them in there, and then eventually they do meet up with other Southlanders, and she's reunited with her fiance, and of course that ties us into the end scene, which we can
yeah,
talk about, I suppose.
and Isildur obviously he was up all night to get lucky and just didn't.
Yeah. Oh. Dear.
But
Uh,
the scene with the Ents
yeah.
again, there is a weird thing with the scene with the Ents that is something actually it is really awkward in the show, but I feel it's not the show's fault. This is something that actually I think we can actually say is inherited from one of the issues with Tolkien's texts.
Okay.
The Ent wife is really annoyed that someone might have been cutting down trees.
Right.
Have you ever, what was it, laid something to a tree? Like the elves have this whole reputation of being tree hugging hippies and
Yeah.
vegetarians and all of this sort of stuff.
Right.
And yet we know for an absolute fact they cut down trees, they made boats, they built cities. We saw in a previous episode Círdan and all of the but shaving
Well,
and planing trees and
well, we
and
literally saw Arendir with a load of wood, right? Earlier, was
well
it this
that
episode
was
or previous episode? Yeah.
yeah, but that was picking up deadfall. That was picking up branches that are falling on the ground. That is fine. But we know for a fact the elves carve trees, they cut trees down, they use them for industry. The whole point was it was in balance with nature,
Right.
that they weren't dominating nature. But one of the issues with any sort of form of storytelling, it's very easy to fall into this binary dynamic. Oh, the
Mhm.
elves are pro tree, and therefore they wouldn't have carved those living remembrances into the trees. You go, what's Lothlorien? They carved their homes into the trees.
Yeah. Yeah.
What about all their boats? Oh, do you think that was all those planks were made of deadfall? No, they cut stuff down. All of the boat rights, like there's all of this evidence shows that they did this, and then suddenly the Ents are like, "Have you ever cut down a tree?" You're like, "Yeah, everyone has."
Yeah.
Um, so that is an issue from Tolkien's writing, and it's
Hmm.
not the show's fault that we have this impression that elves never cut down trees, that and the Ents acting that way. Have you ever cut? They objected to what Saruman was doing because he was devastating a whole forest. It wasn't one tree here, one tree there, and then replanting and living in symbiosis with the
Right.
tree.
Right.
It was mass devastation. And so that is something, again, it's an uneasiness in Tolkien's own writing.
I, I
Um,
I can see what you're saying, but I also do feel that the inclusion of Ents here was a bit forced. Yeah. Just a tiny bit. Yeah.
yeah, again, the greatest hits. But of course, one thing I like, first of all, they look much more like the Ents of my imagination
Uh-huh.
than Jackson's versions.
Interesting. Yeah.
And to get
Yeah,
to see an,
visually I thought it was cool. Visually it was cool.
yeah, because even the male Ent, like the face is so twisted, it doesn't look like a
Yeah.
face.
Right.
It's it looks like part of the tree. But also seeing the Ent wife, which again was something I didn't know that I really wanted to see, and seeing that actually made me smile.
Yeah.
Um, I like that, and yeah, they going back to that earlier scene, it was the chopping of the wood that obviously
Yes.
drew their attention and caused
Agreed.
them to raid that. And
Yeah.
when Arondir and Isildur like see the body strewn about, torn to pieces, and it looks horrific. That's what the Ents and the Huron did to the orcs after the Battle of the Hornburg.
Yeah.
That brutality, like they come across and it's grisly looking.
Yeah.
It's the horror of what you go. Yeah, that's what they did in the Battle of the Hornburg.
Except it's never visualized, right?
Except we don't get it's all, and then they cleaned up their mess. It's like
Yeah.
hand wavy magic. Oh yeah, like we slaughtered thousands upon thousands of orcs, but left no trace behind. So you can all feel fine about the genocide. Um,
Right.
and so
Here,
I
it's
think,
visualized. It's
yeah,
visualized. Yeah.
I
It's
think that
brutal.
gets through again this aspect of there is a graphic horror to war,
Yeah.
which a lot of epic fantasy glosses over, and that I thought was into like the Ents are not human. The Ents are not.
Right.
They have a different way of thinking.
And you have to respect their power. It's a bit like trying to make a pet out of an elephant or something, You think, oh, it's so cute, but really it could squish you into jelly with one boom, So that is something you should actually be not just respectful of, but you should be scared, right? Yeah, that aspect of it, that honesty about what that sort of violence would look like, I can respect that. Yeah.
Yeah. And so the tying of all of that together with this uneasy relationship between the Southlanders who have escaped Adar and the sort of the people who were never captured and forced to swear allegiance to Adar, and then the Numenorians. We're seeing the complexity of those races of men in that area. Plus, then with the humans of Rune as well. That this growing level of complexity, which again, no, is part and parcel of what Tolkien wrote about, is again, I think, a difficulty that the show has because it is getting more and more complicated with all of these different factions, which
Right.
leads to, and we saw it in even in the Wheel of Time or in A Song of Ice and Fire, that the storylines start to splinter and splinter and splinter as they become more and more complicated.
Spinning out of control in a way that is, at least in this episode,
So it is something to that I think, if the showrunners rein that in a bit and streamline it a bit, again, it
yes,
become a much more persuasive storyline. But
agreed.
they remember in the last episode I was saying there was something that Theo had said that I wanted to remember. It was actually in this episode
Okay.
because Theo leaving them at the end saying, "I have promises of my own to keep."
Yes.
So this emphasis on making promises and breaking promises.
Yep.
That's why I keep thinking that he's going to end up as the king of the dead
Yeah.
in the Dunharrow.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
so I think the last major one to talk about in this one was Elrond and Galadriel, and
Yeah.
this was by far my favorite set of sequences.
Okay. Good. And we see the Barrow-wights who are also being stirred to an awakened state by the evil let loose in the land by Sauron and so on and so forth. Yeah. So did you want to say something first
Well,
about this?
before we get to the Barrow-wight stuff,
Yeah.
there is this sort of the where Galadriel is now the lieutenant. Point
Yeah.
number one for using the British pronunciation of the word.
They have English accents, so of course they're going to say lieutenant, even though there's no F in that word. There's no F.
I don't in care.
I know. I set you up for that one. You can thank me later.
One of the first things about this that I really liked, Galadriel wearing her hair bound as a crown. which
Wow.
is how Tolkien described her in
Huh.
her early life. And I thought that was a really nice touch.
Huh.
But here again, we have that Galadriel is learning this hard lesson. She has had to, like Durin in the last, swallow her pride.
Right.
Because how does one become wise? How does she end up the wise leader? She has had to learn these difficult lessons.
Yeah.
This is part of her growth. And I think that what we see in the whole sequence with this of Elrond being basically a bit of a dick. And let's
Yeah.
face it,
Sauron, come on. He's gonna have a moment of serious growth here. Yeah.
but then again, he's an elf and elves can be like that. But
Yeah.
Galadriel having to swallow her pride, having to defer to someone, having to follow that, to get demoted
Yeah.
and live with it, and yet still going, right, I am still going to do the right thing. This, I think this is a wonderful part of her arc, her character arc, her development. Because
Mhm.
if she had remained static, oh, she's wise Galadriel all the way through, that, yeah, you can have static characters. It's fine to have, but it's much more interesting to have a dynamic character arc that shifts and changes over time, and she will end up being the Galadriel that we know, and we're seeing that
I'm
in
interested in
development.
seeing that happen. Yes. Yes.
Um, and the other thing, like Elrond's distrust of the rings,
Yes. That's part of what leads him to be such a dope. I mean, even when she sacrifices herself to get them out of there, he's like, oh, she just did it to save the ring, you know.
and
Uh,
yet, and again, I think this is where Elrond misses the point. I think this is a massive error that Elrond makes
right.
because she willingly gave up her ring.
Yes.
And I think this is such a huge thing in this. When
Yeah.
faced with this, Galadriel gives up her ring, gives it to Elrond. This is not the ring is mine, it is my precious. It's none of those things.
Right.
Galadriel goes, no, take it. Don't let it fall into evil hands. You take it. I am going to stay behind.
Despite how we've seen how powerful it is, it actually healed the one elf who had been shot with the arrow. It keeps manifesting these powers. You would think that it would be more tempting to keep it, but yeah.
And weirdly enough, I think people are going to have an issue with that. And yet, I think that's entirely in keeping with the power of the rings, in that
Uh-huh.
they are used to preserve and heal.
Right.
Elrond is known as a great healer. He
Right.
also just so happens to have an elvish ring.
He ends
That
up with
this
the one that Gil-galad has. Right. Yeah.
and the wound that Galadriel heals here is a simple orc arrow, not
Right.
a Nazgul blade.
Right.
What wounded Frodo was much more serious. Also, Frodo is a halfling. The
Yeah.
person wounded here was an elf, and it was previously established. Elves are more hardy. Elves can survive these things better. So I actually think this is entirely keeping with what Galadriel can do with her ring, how the
Mm.
rings have been introduced, what the ring's powers are. That this is part and parcel, and it is I think, a very reasonable, rational, and valid interpretation of the power of these rings. I don't
Mhm.
have a problem with her doing that healing at all. I think that is very fitting. Um, but the I I did feel bad for the whatever the map the map elf. He
Uh-huh.
was. It's like I am a warrior. Like I have these. I'm an archer. I've got the map, guys. And it was you're like, dude, you should not be on this quest. Um, I felt so bad for him, and of course, he's the only one who gets shot. You're like,
Yeah.
idiot.
Right.
Uh, but they did have this wonderful like the elves running across the mountaintops to see that grandeur and that scale.
Cinematic moments. Yeah.
Yeah.
Nice. Yeah.
And remember, this is a TV show. One of the big comparators we keep making all the time are the films, the giant cinematic masterpieces.
Yeah.
And yet, this is a TV show doing that.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think we lose sight of the fact this is just a TV show. And
Right.
yet, the natural comparator is a blockbuster cinematic that swept the Oscars. That's the
True.
comparator.
Although it is a TV show with a pretty good sized budget.
Yeah. Oh no, I acknowledge that. But the
Yeah.
fact that that's not occurring on TV, I
I
don't
mean,
think we should ignore that.
yeah.
So what did you think of the Barrow-wight scene? There was one thing in the Barrow-wight scene that I went, "Oh, you have got to be kidding. Why? Why?" One thing. I want to see if it's the same one, if you have an issue with it.
Well, I mean, so initially they're obviously overmatched because every time they try to kill one of these things, it just sort of regroups, right? They slash it, and then it's like, nope, you didn't get me. It seems like a fairly hopeless situation. But then Elrond remember, oh, we need to get the blades that are buried with them. Follow me, guys. And I didn't see that transition happen extremely well. It was slightly confusing to me, but apparently that's what they did. They succeeded in getting at least one or more of these blades out of the barrows, which looked awfully pristine, I guess because they're magic blades. But then they were able to effectively dispatch the Barrow-wights. Yeah, I mean, and the fact that we established that these nasty things are extremely dangerous in the first place because the one elf gets dragged into, by the chains into the barrow to start this whole action sequence off with. Yeah, and the spookiness and everything, the mystery of it was, I thought, something that was well done. That's definitely how it feels in the book, in Fellowship of the Ring, when Frodo and the other hobbits end up there. So I appreciated that it was spooky at least. But yeah, no, I mean it was. They worked it in there, I guess. It had a feel of another. Okay, here's another cameo.
Well,
But
I think cameo is the wrong thing, but again, I think it was here's one of the greatest hits
right, right,
that Jackson didn't do. And the thing is, I thought they looked stunning. They were frightening. I thought visually the wights were brilliantly realized. The use
right,
of the chains, the cold metal binding people tied in very, very neatly to this whole idea of them. And
yeah,
weirdly enough, there's a really nice connection to obviously a lot of the stuff in the history, in that the barrows where the Barrow-wights are ancient, like way before a lot of the wights, obviously, that Frodo et al. Meet.
right.
But those barrows
Have
were
to
on,
be because that stuff happens later, right?
yeah, but those barrows were on top of other barrows. Like the entire thing has been there for a long time. And that ties into that whole archaeological notion of our own world, where we keep building settlements on top of other settlements, that this
Right.
is recurring. And one of the things that I really, really liked, Sauron disguises himself as the necromancer
Mm-hmm.
much later on, and he awakens the spirits,
Right.
the Barrow-wights. What we see here is the Barrow-wights were awake. Elrond and Galadriel and the other elves use these weapons that put them back to rest, which still leaves it open for
Oh,
Sauron to come along later and awaken them as the necromancer.
but they have to be different, as you pointed out, different Barrow-wights, later ones, because the ones in Lord of the Rings, obviously, they're from, the time when I believe when you had Arnor, right?
Mm-hmm.
And
Arnor, yeah.
Arnor was fighting against uh, uh, the Witch King, particularly, right? So
Yeah.
I
But
believe whatever the case, those Barrow-wights had to be from after
yeah,
this
but
particular moment. Yeah.
the whole reason why I think this can actually fit in quite neatly without disturbing any aspect of canonicity
Right.
is
Right.
because so they all get put to sleep, which means when it comes, oh, we need burial places for all of these kings. We'll just use those ones. And there aren't these giant wights running around that are going to kill everyone, because why
Right.
would you use that burial site? You
Right.
wouldn't. But now they can, which
Right.
leaves it open
There's a
for
vacancy.
Sauron to do the thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
And to be perfectly honest, I think that's actually quite neat.
Hmm.
Do you want to know what my I
Issue?
can't believe, big issue with it was?
Sure.
Do you remember when the two messengers got killed in the forest and their
Yeah,
bodies are dragged away by
being
chains and
dragged.
you go, ooh, and that was quite cool. Where did these chains come from? Awesome. And obviously it turns out to be the Barrow-wights. What did the camera linger on? Here's the message that never got delivered that's lying discarded on the ground.
Right,
And what do Galadriel and Elrond find? The bloody message.
right.
No, because that means that these messengers must have randomly run through all of these barrows and that's where they got killed, except that's not where they got killed. We didn't see them get. I'm like, all you had to do was show that these were the messengers. It would have been fine. You didn't need to look at the message
Uh-huh, uh-huh. Again, a little too on
because
the
the
nose.
viewer already knew the message didn't get delivered. Now the elves know that the messengers were dead and the message isn't there. What happened to it? That would have been fine. But
But you
no, we have
literally
this.
have one of the elves pick up the little cylinder and say, "Oh, and here's the message." I guess it didn't get delivered. Yeah.
It's, it's like, why do you have to do that? There was
Uh-huh.
no need for that.
Uh-huh.
But that sequence where they use their own blades against them, and I thought that was I actually really enjoyed that sequence. I thought the Barrow-wights were genuinely frightening,
Right.
and the chains, that very Marley from A Christmas Carol,
Uh-huh. Yeah.
um, that type of imagery. I thought it worked well, and it ties into them being cold and metallic and being bound to this area.
Yeah.
I really liked it. I thought it was a great sequence, and again, the elves show that like they're powerful, but there are other powerful things out there.
Yeah. Well, and of
Um,
course this ends with Galadriel's noble sacrifice and where she takes on a huge band of orcs and does kick some ass before Adar shows up and extinguishes her flame, right? And says, "Why, hello, Galadriel."
and I
Uh,
thought again the fight sequence with the orcs that actually for me was a lot of fun, and Galadriel is a powerful warrior, like that's in Tolkien.
if you're
Um,
not being super picky about quote, I'm putting this in quotes, realism, in the fight, like would somebody shot with a flaming arrow immediately burst into flames? I don't know, unless he was covered with oil or something.
well, it's a bit like in action movies where people keep getting clunked on the back of the head with like a gun or something. They get knocked out. Not a
Right,
single one of them suffers a concussion.
right, right, right,
It,
right.
it's a
Yeah,
trope of action. But one of the things they did was, at least in this fight, instead of everyone just waiting their turn to fight, there's a reason for them to go, actually, I'm not running up to fight her right now because I don't want to get killed.
right.
Galadriel is frightening in her power.
Yeah.
And I thought that was actually quite well done. And again, Elrond making that mistake, showing that he is not infallible. Again,
Mm,
it's about this I suppose humanizing is the wrong word to talk about elves, but
uh-huh.
making the elves understandable. They are not all powerful, all wise. Wisdom takes time to accrue,
Right.
and showing Elrond making that mistake. But again, we can see that Galadriel is on the path to become Galadriel. Elrond, I still think, has to make some mistakes and then he can be on that accelerated path.
Right.
Because again, his pride, his judgment
Right.
is getting in the way.
It's all interesting too when you think that he eventually becomes her son-in-law, right? But
Which when I'm wondering how now they're going to introduce Celeborn,
yeah, yeah.
which it's still entirely possible. Um, it's just it's interesting. But yeah, I the storyline with Galadriel and Elrond, I really liked. It shows Elrond increasing in power. It
Hmm.
shows Galadriel on her arc. That
Really important
relationship,
dynamic. Yeah.
And the relationship between them is much more complicated, more nuanced, and there's more of a back and forth,
Yeah.
which there should be. That was good. I thought the sequence with the Barrow-wights looked stunning, sounded stunning, was
Mm.
eerie and horrible and scary. And admittedly, Elrond going, I read it in the lore. I'm like, are you part of the Tolkien fandom? The lore says, okay.
Yeah.
But so I thought that for me, that was the line I objected to.
Uh-huh.
Whereas Galadriel saying, go back to the shadow, that I
Yeah.
didn't have a problem with because,
Oh, I thought, why do that? Because you're asking to be compared. You're asking for it. And in that case, I don't think it's a favorable comparison, but nah, you know.
yeah, but there are only so many ways to tell people to go away and go back to the darkness that they serve. You're like, yeah, in the moment, like she's not a poet. Elrond would have thought up something better, given his love of poetry.
Maybe,
But
maybe.
that wasn't Galadriel's strong point. And with Adar arriving at the end, I think this is actually this is a really interesting moment for me.
Hmm.
They are clearly on opposite sides. But much like America and the West during World War II and Russia,
Right.
there is another enemy who they both agree is an enemy. And
Right. Right.
this is a really interesting moment.
Let's see
And
what they
also
do with
like
this. Yeah,
and Adar remembers being an elf.
of course. Yeah. Yeah.
So again, I think, I am much more positive on this show, I think, than a lot of people. But
Right.
this particular episode, I think, was the weakest of them for me. And it was the one that really came across as here are the greatest hits from Lord of the Rings that we are going to replay for you
Agreed.
as a remix.
Yeah.
Um, and it had a couple of those really cliched moments, like the stick in the mud sequence, the oh look, here's the message that was left behind. Those things I didn't enjoy as much, and it's fine if other people love them. That's great, but
Sure.
I didn't. Um,
Yeah. But I'm still invested in this series, and I'm curious to see like you said, there are some things that will be interesting to see what they do with them, like Adar and Galadriel, and are they going to be, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, at least right now. So let's see. I'll be curious to see what they do with episode 5, and of course to discuss it with you.
and of course, we're all forgetting the big media. I'm getting the Blue Wizard storyline, regardless of who's in it. I'm getting my Blue Wizard storyline, and that you have no that makes me incredibly happy. This is something that I did want to see. I could do with like that the hobbits being in it, but
Well, at least you're getting the Blue Wizards. That's the important thing.
well,
Yeah.
Philip, thank you once again. And for those of you still watching, thank you very much for watching. Thank you for your continued support, and I will see you in the next one.